Today we have Blair Libby. He serves as the program manager for the Confederate Salish and Kootenai Tribes Natural Resources Department. Blair has worked in environmental education in the Sonoran Desert and wetland restoration in coastal estuaries prior to attending the University of Montana, where he received his master's in environmental studies and certificate in natural resource conflict resolution, which actually is probably very applicable to what's going on a lot with wetlands right now. In his current role, Blair coordinates wetland monitoring efforts, assists CSKT colleagues in wetland resource issues, and is currently updating the tribe's 1999 Wetland Conservation Plan. Blair? And hey, Tiffany, did you rest that?
No, yeah, no problem. You'll hear me through this mic a little bit. Great. All right, you're good. We're ready. Hi, so I'm the Wetlands Program Manager, which is a funny term because there's a lot of people at CSKT that do a lot more with wetlands than I do. So it's an interesting role, and I end up doing, I think, kind of a de facto education and outreach work for the tribes around wetlands, run a monitoring program, but it's great to see some other people in the room that have a lot more experience with wetlands with the tribes than I even do. Well, whoops, was that me? No problem. Great. So we will go ahead and start out, and it's okay to switch slides. Just to put some context to the traditional territories of the tribes that make up CSKT, which is the Salish and the Kalispé or Pend Oreille and the Kootenai tribes. And this is a map which you can see the outline of the Flathead Reservation near Flathead Lake, and then what originally was the other portion of the reservation down in the Bitterroot Valley. But you can see that the territory spreads wide and far across this region. And if you look closely, I know it's a little blurry, but you can make out where Helena is. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that word in Salish because I have a pretty bad English accent. I'm trying to speak it, but it translates to cottonwoods atop, or cottonwoods above the water. And I can send out this map in a less blurry form to folks if you're interested. And this is published by the Salish Kalispé Culture Committee. And many of these place names, the vast majority of them have to do with waters and wetlands. I live in Missoula near the downtown area, and it's the confluence of Rattlesnake Creek and the Clark Fork River, and that's the place of the small bull trout. The Blackfoot confluence is place of the large bull trout, translated, of course. So the importance of wetlands and water to the Salish and all the tribes that make up the reservation and all the tribes everywhere, it runs deep. And then focusing in on the reservation. Maybe that way? No, lost it. Yeah, that'd be great. Is that okay?
Sure.
Great, thanks. Here's a map of the reservation. So many of you are probably familiar. It's 1.3 million acres, and really only a small portion of Flathead Lake is on the reservation, and it's only 5% of the total land area. But we have 40,000 acres of wetlands and 1,000 linear miles of streams that are perennial, and if you include seasonal and intermittent, it's significantly more miles of stream and rivers. So it's a very water-rich resource, and it's become a treasured home for CSKT since the Hellgate Treaty of 1855 and since the last Bitterroot Salish were marched up to the reservation in the 1890s. And to focus on the water and the protection of those resources, CSKT, through the tribal council and staff over the years, really, I like to think of it as starting out since 1977, have enacted many ordinances and programs to try to protect these resources. So these are ones that I like to focus on that stand out to me as sort of what are most important, especially as we're looking forward in the post-Sackett era. So I'll dive into a few of these, all of them today, but first I want to focus on the 1977 Shoreline Protection Ordinance. So that gives, I think, the best context for what we're dealing with today, especially with Flathead Lake and low water levels, which you probably have also all heard about. So this, in the late 70s, there was a family that constructed a very large breakwater into the lake, which the tribes objected to, and they sued. And over 5 years of court battles that eventually ended up in the 9th District Court of Appeals, the tribes were agreed to have authority over having regulation of structures and dams. So what this does is it helps to register all the docks on Flathead Lake. It permits any kind of, I think Sage can probably get into this a little bit more than me because this is not my role at the tribes, but looking at what kinds of bank, I should say shoreline stabilization they're doing. And it's protecting the remaining marsh because there's very little, because Flathead Lake at full pool is now about 8 feet higher than it is naturally. So this is one of the best marsh areas right near Polson, Montana, off Ducharme Point. And the great thing about the Shoreline Protection Ordinance is it's run by an independent review board, which is made up of tribal staff, fee non-tribal landowners. Fee is kind of like private land on the reservation, basically the same thing. And it goes through a rigorous process whenever, and review by the Army Corps of Engineers whenever they're trying to permit some kind of construction on the lake. And then ALCO, Aquatic Lands Conservation Ordinance. So this started in 1987, and it's a tribal ordinance, and it's really modeled after the 404 program. And it's different and distinct because it's not waters of the United States, it's waters of the reservation. So it's a similar definition used for wetlands, but anything that is considered a wetland under that definition would be jurisdictional under ALCO. There's a few differences. I think the quote in the ordinance is it excludes wholly man-made wetlands. So there are certain things that ALCO does not consider jurisdictional that the Corps actually does, which is some great overlap there. Another really strong point of the ALCO program, it works closely with the Shoreline Protection Ordinance. It's run by the same board, so there's that independent review board, and there's a really strong set, or more of a matrix, for compensatory mitigation ratios. So it's higher mitigation ratios, and the idea behind that didn't start till 1999. I'll show that later, is to make more effective mitigation on the reservation for these all the wetlands and waters on the reservation. I'll get more into that first, but as the tribes over the past 50 plus years, I suppose, 55 years since the Shoreline Protection Ordinance came into being, have worked on all of these ordinances to protect the resources. Then SACA came in, that's for dramatic effect. So there are some concerns, and there's some ways that we're trying to fill the gaps as well, the focus of this conversation today. So I'll start on what people are at the tribes and beyond are most scared about. There are federally non-jurisdictional wetlands, of course, on the reservation. Many of the Pingo Scar features, which are a really unique formation that you've probably seen if you've driven Highway 93 up through the Mission Valley, and the Prairie Pothole wetlands that are in that same area. Many of them are not considered jurisdictional. We haven't done a thorough analysis of determining exactly what is jurisdictional and what is not. But that's great to hear that the state is working on something like that. And then many streams, especially on the western side of the reservation, you get to the other side of the mountains where it's more arid, those are also not going to be considered federally jurisdictional. And the issue with this is that the Aquatic Lands Conservation Ordinance 87A has not been tested in court like the Shoreline Protection Ordinance from a decade earlier has. So the concern is if there's a developer that comes in and would like to, thinks that the wetland that there is on their property that they're going to develop on is non-jurisdictional and they won't have to mitigate for it, let's say, and then the Shoreline Protection Board rules that they will have to because it's water of the reservation, that they'll litigate. and something that our administrator for the Shoreline Protection Office often says, and I've heard other staff say, is like, is this the case that you want to hang your hat on? We can get more into this in a second, and I think there are reasons to think that this probably might not be an issue, but there's always the concern because it hasn't gone to court. So it's something that our legal team at CSKT and the Shoreline Protection Office is very wary of. Also, there's a lot of people moving to Montana, right? And a surge in development and permits. There are more permits being processed by the ALCO and Shoreline Review Board right now, which is great. That means that people are learning. But there's probably still unpermitted activities going on that we don't know about because it's 1.3 million acres. There's really only 3 people directly involved with the Aquatic Lands Conservation Ordinance. And there are, I think the Natural Resource Department has at least 150 staff, but that's a lot of acreage and we have many other responsibilities. So I like this picture as a great example, which I took from Zillow. This is a property selling right outside downtown Polson near our natural resource office up there. And it's $1.3 million. And as you can see, there are plenty of wetlands on the property. And it's actually sold to a few different people, as I understand it, over the past few years, because folks don't understand, I think, necessarily federal regulations around wetlands and what defines a wetland, what it is. But also folks don't know about the Shoreline Protection Ordinance and Aquatic Lands Conservation Ordinance. So this is an easy one to keep our eyes on because all of us drive past it on our commute to work every day. But there are many others that have really beautiful wetland resources on them that we are not able to have a close look at. But of course, there's reason to be hopeful with everything we're discussing here. And this is a great photo from my coworker, Craig Barfoot. This is one of the properties that the tribes manage over in the Sealy Valley, that Beaver Lodge and the Larches. This is that compensatory mitigation ratio that I was talking about. So this is a recommendation. It's not in the ALCO ordinance. It's in the 1999 Wetland Conservation Plan, which we're currently updating because there's been a lot of work in the past 25 years, it needs to be updated. But this is the guide that folks who are the resource specialists in the tribes, like myself, Victoria, and Taryn, you're referencing this as well, are looking at when we're providing comment on projects and that people are applying for an ALCO permit for. So you can see the ratios are significantly higher than a 1-to-1 in most cases. And the design, this was Mary Price and Seth Makepeace, and I think Tom was involved in this and other folks back in 1999, was to make more effective mitigation for any loss in wetlands, and depending on what kind of wetland it is and at what kind of project it's going to be. So this is a good thing that we have and we generally use, and I think for the most part, the average is a 3-to-1 ratio for mitigation on the reservation, but there are some projects like the Finley Flats Wetland Preserve that we worked on with MDT, and that was a much more complicated equation of using not just a 3-to-1 ratio, but trying to go through this matrix as it was designed. Also, there's other ordinances. This is kind of going back to that timeline I showed in one of the earlier slides that are not specifically to do with mitigation or jurisdictionality of wetlands, but are really progressive tactics that the tribes is taking. This, I think, was drafted in 2019 and finally passed by the Tribal Council in 2021. It's the Cultural Waterways Ordinance. And the way that I like to think of it is as a form of environmental personhood. Really what it's getting at, instead of it protecting an area specifically for its ecological value, it's sort of designed in the same way that the tribes approach some of the wilderness areas and the primitive areas, if you're familiar with those on the reservation, which are primitive areas are tribal member only, where it's really trying to tie in the ecological importance is it's inseparable from the cultural significance. And in this case, it's waterways, right? It's cultural waterway ordinance, not just a land base or a species. So it designated the first cultural waterway on this ordinance as the Lower Flathead River. So that's from the SKQ Dam, which is at the southern end of Flathead Lake, down to Paradise, Montana, essentially at the exit of the reservation. It's about 65 miles. And yesterday, we applied to a grant to finally write the management plan for that waterway. But it's things like this and ordinances and programs like a cultural waterways ordinance, I think, allow us to have a little bit more of the voluntary restoration and mitigation go on. The process for writing this management plan is going to be many facilitated discussions with probably folks in this room, but also fee landowners, ranchers. It's going to be the many more recreators that are using the Flathead River corridor, which has surged, of course, since COVID, with people moving here and just wanting to get outside more. So this is a way that I see forward to sort of fill that gap. And it's really an educational outreach campaign as well. If you're getting people together at the table, finding these common interests and values, this is a good way to start it. And then we have a bunch of other programs. That's a photo of former CSKT Tribal Council Chairman signing the Montana Water Rights Protection Act, or the Water Compact, which really started this fantastic restoration program that Taryn and Victoria and Tabby Espinoza are working in, along with others. And that is basically, the goal is to restore our irrigation system, which is aging and 100 years old, to get more in-stream flow on the natural streams on the reservation, while providing sufficient water and registration of water rights for irrigators on the reservation. And that whole $2 billion, whatever it is, of legislation is going to, and it already is fueling, a lot of great mitigation work and restoration of wetlands on the reservation. The Shoreline Office knows that we need to educate people, going back to those folks who keep transferring that lakefront property because they're unaware of wetland mitigation requirements. They're meeting with realtor groups and new landowners on the reservation and trying to make themselves a little more available, 21st century, digital availability, that sort of thing. We're trying to monitor wetlands more. We've had a rotational approach to wetland monitoring in our 7 watersheds that we divide the reservation into. That's been going on since 2004. That's kind of what the wetlands program is that I'm a part of. And we've been doing about 5 monitoring sites and 15 new assessment sites under MWAM procedures through MDT. But we're trying to increase that significantly because we're doing data analysis right now with GM Consulting and some other contractors and folks, and realizing we should have more data. And we can probably apply to grants like through the Bureau of Reclamation that we applied to yesterday, and through the EPA, and maybe some state grants in the future, to allow for more monitoring and data collection, just to have a better handle on what is going on the reservation, because it's so large. Which gets to the grant funding. And then also there's some great mitigation partnerships and agreements, and I think common understanding with partners like MDT, work that's gone on with Larry over the years, and Bill and many other folks, of an understanding of the sovereignty aspect of ALCO 87A, and sort of how important that is moving forward in a relationship with the tribe. Seems to be kind of a sign of mutual respect that's working out well. I'll also mention, because there was talk earlier about assumption of 404 programs, and that's something that has been discussed like in conversations with NOM actually, and Donna's colleagues there, of if that's going to be an effective way to move forward. And I think the approach for CSKT is, even with the threat of litigation over something like ALCO, because it's a tribal ordinance and it's working as we want it to, and hopefully it can only improve with more monitoring and awareness of the ordinance. probably assumption is not the way that the tribes want to head. And it's keeping this ALCO 87A sort of in-house as its own tribal ordinance. That makes sense. So all in there, I think I have a few more minutes of time for questions, and hopefully I can answer, and maybe my coworkers can help if I can't answer.
Yeah, we have, since we got started a little late, we have about 10 minutes if
Great.
there are questions. Remember, please state your name and who you're with before you ask it.
Livia Shaudas with GM Consulting. Blair, do you know, I don't know if there's other tribal representatives here in the room, but do you know on other reservations, are there similar programs like ALCO on all of the other reservations or any?
Yeah, if anyone wants to speak up, if there is another representative here, or if anyone knows, that'd be great. Yeah, here we go.
Thank you. Hello, Emerald Grant, Blackfeet Indian Reservation, Wetlands Project Manager. We do have our own wetlands program to basically to keep what we have. We find that a lot of it too is with the WOTUS is not under protection to the United States, so we're doing our best to consider making our own laws and keeping them to protected. So hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, I think ALCO might be somewhat distinct. It sounds like other programs might be working towards something, or another tribal councils and equivalents. There's also, I know Northern Cheyenne Tribe has a really fantastic water quality standards related to wetlands that takes in cultural importance of some species, especially based on how I think it was mining waste was affecting some of these keystone cultural species, which I'm not an expert on, but that's something that we're looking at too. Is that a way to, again, fill the gap, something like wetland water quality standards?
Thanks. Alan Zackheim with Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I was wondering how, last year there was a big issue with super low water levels in Flathead Lake. How did that interplay with some of these wetland conservation efforts?
Yeah, because the Shoreline Protection Office was dealing with that because they registered docks, and that's what people were, I think, mostly unhappy about, is that their static non-floating docks they couldn't use them to get into their boats. Many threats. We have bulletproof glass in our office doors now. So I think it's yeah, because ALCO is tied to the Shoreline Protection Office, people are targeting that with misinformation and probably granted frustration as well. I understand where people are coming from, but it's a tough topic because SKQ Dam is managed by Energy Keepers Inc., which is in partnership with CSKT as well, but the dam has to maintain, of course, flows in the lower Flathead River. That's part of their operating license. So yeah, I think, I guess the simple answer is that there are probably people taking a much closer look at the permitting process through ALCO, which is good in some ways. Maybe people are becoming more aware, but just kind of keeps that office on their toes. Did you add anything to that?